Okay, hello everybody. Once again for today's session on climate change and climate justice. So, are there any questions from your side? Have you been able to access the materials for this session? Have you been able to access the recording of the last session? Chris agrees. Yeah, if you just quickly agree. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Um, well, um, if there are no further concerns or questions, then I would actually already start introducing our guest lecturer of today. As I've said last week, Francesca is from Rome, Italy. She's doing her PhD on theories of justice. You have received a bunch of literature to read. I hope you have been able to read through it. It is a kind of a big topic. Theories of justice are a big issue in philosophy, but it also touches a major concern in environmental justice research. And as we are speaking about climate change and climate justice, I think it is very important to distinguish the role conceptions of justice play or can play when discussing environmental concerns. So, as in the last week, we are going to do it the same way. I'm going to hand over the voice to Francesca. In case you have a question, just raise your hand, and as usual, I will hand over to you. So, I know Francesca for quite a while. When I was at FFU and she came from Italy for a research visit. And since then, we have been working together. Francesca also is a member of the Environmental Justice Institute, and we are right now working on an article on theories of justice. So your critical response will certainly help us to maybe set one or the other emphasis for the article as well. So Francesca, very welcome. A warm applause, please, for our new guest, and I will silence myself.
So, first of all, good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming. Today, we're going to talk about theories of climate justice with a major focus on the concept of justice. And just to start, I would like to make clear that there is a strong connection between climate justice and environmental justice. So, as you probably already know, the thing is that environmental justice as a concept has a strong influence on the way that climate justice has been conceptualized. And so basically, it's quite important to start to think about and to rethink the concept of justice as a part of the climate change debate. And so basically, the main goals of this lecture are to focus on what we are talk about when we talk about justice in its close relations to environmental justice. And then we are going to see also how different approaches to justice come into play in practice. So how can we apply those different approaches to justice in a different environmental issues? So just to refresh your memory, here you can read a definition of environmental justice, and this actually the definition provided by the USA Environmental Protection Agency. And I've just underlined three main aspects that are quite important. For instance, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, and so on. So this is the first point. And the second one is that everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process. So basically we have 3 points, and those 3 points are also crucial to identify the three dimensions of environmental justice. So basically, if we look at the concept of justice, so if the question is, what is the justice of environmental justice? The answer is that we have those three dimensions of justice. The first one is basically the distribution. So the thing is that what it's quite important is just to make clear that the first claims of environmental justice activists was based on the thing that environmental burdens as well as environmental benefits were not equally distributed. So, for instance, the case was the landfills or toxic waste. And but this is just the first phase of the environmental justice struggles. The second stage is just the second phase is just to ask the question, what are the origins of this unequal distribution? And the answer is very linked to the second dimensions of environmental justice. So the lack of recognition. And this is also a very important aspect of the question because, and as you already know, probably in the USA, at the very beginning of the rise of this concept, environmental justice was basically conceived in terms of environmental racism. And the fact was that, of course, environmental burdens are not equally distributed because we are people of color, or we are women, or we are low-income people. So the thing is that we are not recognized as political actors. And this second phase is very linked to the third one and to the third dimension of environmental justice. That is basically the participation, because since people are not recognized as actors, they cannot even participate in the political arena. So those three dimensions of justice correspond also to three approaches. The first one is distributional justice approach, as it was mainly developed by John Rawls. That is, of course, one of the most important author dealing with this approach, but not, of course, the only one. But he is the most important and the most representative of this approach. Then we have the procedural justice approach. And here I mentioned also only David Miller, just an example, but there are many others that deal with this approach. And then we have an entitlements approach. And by this approach, I basically refer to authors like Sen and Nussbaum that developed the capabilities approach, even if in a different ways, because Sen largely developed entitlement approach from an economic perspective, while Nussbaum just developed this approach from a normative perspective. As for the distributional approach, well, the main focus is on the distributional impact of certain environmental policies. So, as we said before, what really matters, according to this approach, is just there is the outcomes in terms of distributional impacts. So, the thing is that environmental burdens and environmental benefits should be equally distributed across communities. And what we have to take into due consideration is, first of all, what is to be distributed. So goods, rights, or capacities, capabilities. This is also an important question. And the second question is, um, what are the principles governing those distributions? So, and those two questions can be analyzed in different perspectives. So among the authors dealing with distributional justice approach, there are different answers, but what is really important is just the equal distribution of environmental burdens and benefits. Well, of course, there are many authors criticizing this particular approach. So, but basically, we can divide in the criticism in three groups. The first group deals with the measure of justice. So basically, the first critique is how can we measure justice? And the answer provided by San, for instance, is that we should go beyond a sole focus on distribution, and we have to take into account mainly what people can do with those resources. And so basically, what is really important is not that people receive a certain amount of goods or to distribute, for instance, environmental benefits, but the capacity of the people to convert those goods into something else that is useful for their well-being. So the aim of a theory of justice is not just the distribution of certain goods, but is the human flourishing, so the well-being. And the third group, the second group, deals with the democratic participation in decision making. So basically, even in this case, the distribution is not only is not the only thing that really matters, but even the democratic participation is really important, and probably it's more important than distribution. And finally, the third group basically goes into the same direction in the because basically mentioned that it's really important to prevent certain environmental risks instead of distributing risks in terms of externalities. like like Rawls, for instance, envisioned in his theory. So I think that this quotation from Faber is really important to understand this concept. So the aim of environmental justice is not just about distributing risks equally, but preventing them from being produced in the first place. This is the main point. As for the procedural justice approach, well, the main goal is just providing just procedures or fair procedures. So what what is really important according to this approach is just that the process through which environmental decisions are made should be fair, and also um, according to this approach, um, just institutions should ensure a meaningful involvement of the people in the decision making procedures. So, and as long as those two pillars of procedural justice are accomplished, so procedural fairness and meaningful involvement of the people in the decision making, then environmental decisions are considered just, regardless the distributional impacts. So, and especially for this aspect, procedural justice approach was very criticized because um, one should move the objection that um, fair procedures alone cannot automatically ensure, first of all, the distributional impacts, and secondly, the recognition of the communities involved. So I will give you an example just to understand this point. Imagine that we have a public hearings and the communities can participate by having a speech of about 3 minutes. And the procedures are quite fair because all the people involved has those 3 minutes of time. But in some cases, local government will decide, regardless the claims um, of the people involved. So, and perhaps because they are not considered as actors that as relevant actors, or maybe because of their lack of expertise in certain environmental issues, or because they are unequal in power. So can happen that even though we have those fair procedures and we can participate, then we are not able to influence the decisions in any respect. When we talk about entitlements approach, we basically refer to the rights. So basically, the purpose of this approach is just to ensure certain rights to the people, and in order to do that, we should imagine a sort of a threshold level. At least this is how Nussbaum calls this the minimum standard that we have to satisfy. So basically, the thing is that if we think that the people have a right to an environmental quality, um, just institutions are those institutions that will try to ensure this right, um, by providing an effective access to and control over environmental goods. So the thing is that we have a goal, we have that is a right. So our goal is to ensure environmental the right to an environmental quality, and so we have to improve, to promote, and to do whatever we can to achieve this outcome. And in order to achieve this outcome, we establish just a minimum standard, so a minimum threshold. And so what really matters is not just that we start from the same point, like in the case of roles. Roles, what is really important is just that we have fair equalities and fair the same opportunities, and we start from the same point. In the case of entitlement approach, we want to achieve a certain degree, a certain threshold of an outcome. So our goal is just to achieve just outcomes that are basically the rights. Of course, there are objections also to this approach, especially if we think to apply the entitlements approach to environmental issues. And one critique is provided by Brina Holland, and she basically says that um, the link between ecological concern and social justice is missing. So basically, Brina Holland explicitly criticizes Nussbaum because she underlines the fact that it is very important to take into account even the ecological concern and in its link, in its close links to social justice, and especially in Nussbaum's theory, this link is not quite is not very developed. So this is one point, and the second objection regards the individualistic framework. So basically, entitlements approach is individualistic by nature because since capabilities are associated to rights, the right is by nature something that is considered as individual. So we don't have many examples of collective rights. And this is quite important because, as you certainly know, environmental justice has a major focus on the communities. So in this case, by using this approach, we miss basically the collective dimension of and the concept of environmental justice. Okay, so at this point, I will try just to give you an example of how we can apply those approaches in a concrete case. And first of all, we are going to talk about the distributional approach, the distributional justice approach in practice. And basically what I want to make clear is that when we think about this particular approach, and when we think about the distribution, we don't. We should basically ask the question: to what extent can we tolerate social and economic inequalities? So basically, um, what Rawls thinks is that an equal distribution of certain environmental burdens or benefits um, does not mean that we share in equal parts, so that we have a piece of the same piece of pizza, right? But we have to consider that um, the distribution should be done by considering and by taking into due account the least advantaged members of the society. So what is really important when we use Rawls is just to have in mind his two principles of justice. And the first is related to the fair equality of opportunity. So we have to start from the same point. And um, this is related to the formal freedom. So basically, we have basic rights and basic um, liberties that are the same for everyone. And the second principle is what Rawls calls the difference principle. And this is exactly what I said before. So basically, we can tolerate a certain degree of inequalities as long as the least advantaged members of society are not damaged. And the main thing is that Rawls is not a communist, but he's a liberalist. So basically, um, we should have the possibility to start from the same point, but then the outcomes can be also different. Doesn't matter, but they cannot do so different. They cannot do in a way that the least advantaged members of the society are damaged. So this is how we should apply Rawls, and in particular a distributional approach. And the second example is how to apply procedural justice approach. Well, this picture is also important to understand the background of this approach, because in chess, basically the rules come first, then reality. And according to this approach, what is really important is just the rules, because the rules come first, and reality just follows as a consequence. So the goal of this approach is just having fair procedures, because the firm belief of this approach is that as long as we have fair procedures, so as long as we have mechanisms to involve people in the decision making, uh, we will also have a just distributional approach, or everything will follow as a consequence. But just institutions just have to ensure that that we have um, um, just procedures. So, as an example of this, we can um, certainly should we can certainly take into consideration how the communities are to be involved in all the stages of the planning process, and also we can also think about the meaningful involvement of them in terms of, for instance, promote public hearings held in multiple languages. So this is also an important issue, an important question of environment or on of procedural justice approach. Um, so, for example, in public hearings, we should ensure that people has the same amount of time to explain their disease or their protest, and or rather, local government has to provide documents or report, even written in different languages, or for instance in English, just in case that the population um, um, of that city maybe is composed from a significant percentage of foreigners, for instance. And then, as for the entitlements approach, yeah, this picture is also um, quite useful, and uh, is related to a famous example of provided by Sen, because um, when he criticized the roles and how he measured justice in terms of uh, social primary goods, so just the distribution of certain certain goods. He said what is really important is just to see how the people use those goods and how they can convert those goods into capabilities. And the example of the bike is quite um, useful to understand what he meant by convert resources into capabilities. So by using this approach, we basically want to consider both means and outcomes. So legal tools are very useful to this aim, but only as a means. And then what is really important from an entitlements approach perspective is to check the outcomes, and outcomes are basically the rights, or um, rather a certain threshold level of the rights that has to be ensured by just institutions. Now I'm going to give you an example of how those approaches can be used mm, in a case, in the same case. How can we read basically the same case from different perspectives? The case is that, for instance, the local government of a city want to promote um, a particular plan to transform the city into a smart city. And basically one of the key aspects of this plan is just to promote the use of the bike. So in this case, if we use the distributional approach, the main thing is how to distribute the bikes. And of course, when we talk about distribution, we always talk about the scarcity of resources. So, since we don't have um, enough bikes for all the population, we have to choose different principles just to make sure that the distribution is made in a just and fair way. So, in that case, we can say, well, when we distribute bikes, we have to be very sure that the least the least advantaged members of society um, received would receive a bike or maybe discount or something like that. So they our major focus should be on those groups first, and then we can talk about the other groups. If we apply instead um, a procedural justice approach, we can say, well, the main goal in this case is just to be sure that the people are involved in our decision making. So basically, we can organize, for instance, public hearings, or we can distribute surveys, we can promote um, some forum um, just to distribute some information to the community and just to provide some reports or documents that explain uh, how we can uh, how the local government wants um, to implement this plan, and maybe to ask them to participate in some way. Then, if we apply the third approach, so entitlements approach, we know that our main goal are rights. So we can say, well, the whole community has a right um, to have, for instance, a smart city, and our goal is just to check if um, certain outcomes are achieved or not. And our outcomes is just to make sure that all the people, um, not just that whole people receive a bike, but that whole people can use a bike. So we should, for instance, organize some courses or to ask parents to help children to ride a bike, or to, of course, to organize courses where we can where the local government um, gives the possibility to learn how to ride a bike, not only to children but also to other people that maybe are not able to ride a bike. And of course, to achieve this aim, we can use different legal tools. But what uh, what is really important when we use this approach is just the outcomes. It's just to provide and to ensure a minimum standard uh, of the right that we want to achieve. Here you have just some references if you want to read something more about um, different approaches to justice, and um, or if you want just to investigate a little bit more the authors that I have mentioned.
Um, yes, thank you very much for the presentation. Before we are going to do the equal distribution in the groups, I think it's worth we are spending a second on the theory examination that you have heard. Basically, you had the David Schmidt's text as well. The article we are writing is actually on the two different conceptions. The one that Francesca has presented right now, and the other one is David Schmidt's. Have there been questions regarding that what Francesca has presented or regarding that what you have read on David Schmidt's? Then please ask now before we start the exercise. There's a question of Merlin. First, please say to whom you address your question. Merlin, it's yours.
Yeah, I wanted to address a question regarding the presentation. I had a course on political theory a year ago, I think, and one of the sessions was on the text of Nussbaum. And what struck me with her theory in general, and also with the procedural approach to justice, is that the concepts they use seem rather arbitrary to me. Like, at what point do you say minimal standards are well met? What is a minimum standard? At what point is a procedure approachable or open to every possible member of society? And if do we say all members of society or only those interested? And well, what would you respond to a critique of arbitrary well, application of theory, maybe?
Well, when we talk about entitlements approach, and in particular when you talk about Nussbaum, we know that she usually uses the term threshold level. And just an example, just think about, for instance, the situation of China, and think that the air pollution is a quite very dramatic environmental issue, right? So the people are not allowed to go out in the streets because the air is basically too polluted. And in that case, we can say, well, if our outcome is just to ensure a certain um, environmental quality, we should fix, for instance, a standard. So we can say the air pollution or the amount of particulate and so on cannot overcome a certain values. This can be an example. And when we talk about procedural justice, um, basically we just want to make clear that our main goal is just to involve the people through fair procedures. So what is really important is just to fix some fair rules that ensure a certain mechanism to involve the people. And of course, this the procedural justice can have some problems, because since the main goal is having those fair procedures, it can be possible to confuse the means with the ends. So those are certainly very useful legal tools, but we cannot consider those tools as the goals of our um, policy, for instance. And there are, for instance, many scholars that have criticized the procedural justice because it can happen that someone can use this approach in terms of method, and just to obtain different goals. And so there are many scholars dealing with nihilism and law, for instance, and they say, well, if our goal is just some procedures, then doesn't matter the outcomes. So we can use those procedures even for achieving other goals. I don't know if I have answered your question.
Yeah, I think to a degree, but considering the example with the air pollution in China that you made, the threshold that you would say at which point certain entitlements are met and the people have a healthy environment, what kind of threshold is that? Like, let's say the air pollution in China compared to the air pollution in Berlin compared to the air pollution in a small town in, well, I don't know, somewhere where there are no cars and a major industry around. At which point do you say that the threshold is met? Because pollutants are, I would say, always pollutants and polluting and destructive to a healthy environment.
First of all, thanks for your question, because this is actually a very crucial point in regarding entitlements approach, in particular Nussbaum's theory, because many authors have also criticized Nussbaum by arguing that her concept of a threshold was actually quite broad and quite vague, especially because it was very difficult to understand what is exactly the threshold. And also, as you said before, this threshold can be very different from countries to from a country to another country. So for instance, so there is also a critique from Rawls to Sen, and he, even though Sen does not talk about threshold, or at least not in a very explicit way, but still Rawls said, well, this theory of justice would be never be workable, because we need too many informations, we need too many we need to know too many variables just to have the whole information that we need to understand which is exactly this threshold level.
Yeah, I've raised my hand in this regards. You have read, I think, this first chapter of David Schmidt's. Francesca, can you mute your microphone? No, it's not a problem. Sometimes I just hear the big noise. It's one of the questions actually that what Merlin has addressed, which actually is one of the central points of Schmidt's, who is also referring, even quite politely, but critical to Rawls. Would one of you be able to quickly scrutinize the basic principles that David Schmidt's puts like against this approach? I mean, the entitlement approach is not the Rawls approach, but is not so different insofar as it assumes a generalizable theory of justice. So this would be my question to you. Would anyone have an idea of the structure of Schmidt's elements of justice?
Yes, so basically the thing is that do we need a theory of justice, or we need just a roadmap and just a quantity or an amount of elements of justice? And the answer provided by Schmitz is exactly this second one, so that we don't need actually a theory of justice, since it's quite problematic to have a theory of justice that is workable even to other countries, and we still have this problem of the pluralism of justice that is quite linked to the basic structures of the societies. The basic structure of the society is quite different and so it mirrors different inequalities. So basically, another strategy to deal with different approaches to justice is just to leave the idea to find a comprehensive theory of justice, but rather to just to sketch some elements of justice and just to try to find those elements in from case to cases. Let's say that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. My question also was actually directed to the class. Has any one of you read the David Schmidt's text, or like could you just quickly show me who has read the Schmidt's text? Francesca, can you mute yourself? Okay. Now we have a bunch of questions. I will just start with Merlin. You can keep your don't. This wasn't a sign of saying something. Okay. So yeah, I would give word first to Ime. Okay. David, would you be so kind to say something about regarding the question? There's a technical issue with Ime's mic. Okay, sorry. Thanks, Alex, for the clarification. I must make my question a little more clear. The thing is, what I would like to know is like what have been like the basic arguments of David Schmidt's in his text? Like what basically consists of his four elements he has argued, contrary to that what we have heard in the like classical approaches to a theory of justice from a political science viewpoint. Because in that case, okay, Merlin.
Basically, to break it down rather strongly, I would say that he argues that there are different principles of justice and that these different principles can be used or should be used in different circumstances. So that a certain range of issues is governed by one of his of the principles that he derives from other conceptions of justice, and that these can also overlap or be completely separated. But yeah, that they can be used to clarify this issue.
Thank you very much. This was exactly the point I wanted to have mentioned. Can anyone mention the four elements he has established which are overlapping, so that then we would have it actually together, like what he has, like as a contrary, and also like regarding Merlin's first question to Francesca, like this, at which point is this general applicable issue evident, is therefore answered quite differently from Chris has an answer.
Yes, so the four elements in Schmidt's, what he's arguing for, that theories of justice typically are assembled from one or more of these four elements, is first equality, people should be treated equally. Second, desert, people ought to get what they deserve. Third, reciprocity, and fourth, the need, define different class of needs of people. So these are the elements that Schmitz uses. What is not really clear to me is in what sense is this, what you just said, Götz, in contrary to what we just heard from Francesca, because I put it rather like what Schmitz is talking about is the possibility or impossibility of creating a comprehensive theory of justice in every case. I thought like environmental justice would be like a subcategory of justice, of a comprehensive justice theory. So it is not so clear to me why you understand it as a contrary, these two concepts.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. This is exactly the issue I wanted to come to because I don't want to spend the time of Francesca's lecture too long about it. But actually, the thing is, Schmitz. The first point is that Schmitz has a critical part referring to Rawls by saying, actually, assume we are having a situation where we would not know in what kind of society we have to live in and what position is ours in a specific society. So let's assume our class would be on an island and we can decide for a society to live in. However, I mean, we would just discuss about it and we wouldn't know who is going to be queen and who is going to be slave. Then we all would certainly support the idea of Rawls, to support like the least advantaged people, because we would all consider that we might be one of those which are not the advantaged ones. The argument of Schmitz is to say that Rawls assumes that the life is a null-sum game, but it's not a null-sum game. But actually, we are playing the life as if it is a null-sum game. So the theory does not fit the situation. And coming back to the example, it is a little bit like equal opportunities. Everyone would vote for equal opportunities and equal chances if we wouldn't know at which position we are in the society. As a matter of fact, we do know our situation, and this makes our opinion about what kind of equality, what kind of justice is appropriate, quite different. So we would, from a moral standpoint, always say like, okay, let's support the least advantaged. But even those which are saying this would probably not go so far to say, okay, I give up everything what I have as advantages to have the least advantaged supported. So in this regards, Schmitz would say rather like the assumption of a generally applicable theory of justice fails exactly by the transboundaries, because every village, every city, every location is different. It has another mix, which is not generalizable. Okay, who has, some people have technical issues, I read. Merlin?
But I mean, isn't that the whole point of Rawls? That he says that if there is a concept of justice that transcends our social relationships, then it's basically what he derives from his thought project. Or
Sorry, go again. My fault.
I mean, well, what I just argued. That his argument does not become wrong, because even though social relationships that we live in have an influence on our subjective perception of justice. but I don't want to drag this conversation out any much longer because it's already quite late.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm very sorry that I couldn't hold my promise from the beginning. We are again over time, but and this is all on my shoulders. Thank you very much, all of you, for giving the extra minutes, for having such a successful session, regardless of technical shortfalls and my personal shortfall too. Thank you very much to Francesca spending the time here, providing such insights and an interesting group work. All of you, before you leave, I would like to remind you, next week we are going to have the session from 10 a.m. to noon in German time, because John Dreisig is going to speak from Canberra. I would actually really like to suggest you to make everything possible to come, because it's kind of an organizational administrative effort we have undertaken to invite him, so it would be good to have as much people as possible in the virtual classroom. These have been my last words, so the group for next week should approach me if there are any problems accessing the data, materials, or reading. If not, I see you in a week. Thank you very much for coming, and I wish you a pleasant week.